Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we're continuing Abraham's story. We're on part 4. So Genesis 13:10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. So this is where Abram makes the proposition to Lot to go whichever way he would choose to go, because the land couldn't contain both of them, and they strived with each other. Not them, but their herdmen, and it was just too much for all the possessions that Abram had and all the possessions that Lot, his nephew, had. So they could not dwell together in the same land. So he gave him his choice of what land to pick, and he beheld all the plain of Jordan, and it was beautiful to behold, because it was as the Garden of Eden. When it talks about the garden of the Lord, it was talking about the Garden of Eden, that it was well watered and perfect everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord. So it was like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. There's different areas there. A lot of it's desert, but there were areas that are actually pretty good. And I'm going to say, too, the land of Canaan was fair land as well, because, they had the fig trees there, which are considered valuable with them, that they're good, goods and fruit and whatnot that they could freely eat of. And they had the ability to grow vineyards there and all kinds of stuff, grow the crops that they needed and have what they needed there, even in the land of Canaan. But the plains of Jordan, just outside of Sodom and Gomorrah, was very fair and very beautiful land before God destroyed it. So continuing with verse 11, then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. So here this covers how they split up from amongst each other. That way there wouldn't be any more fighting and arguing between the servants of Abram and the servants of Lot, that they'd be able to have peace between each other. And at least this was the goal here before everything happens later on, as we'll get into. But Genesis 13:12, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. So he pitches his tent towards Sodom, and that's where he is dwelling at this point, which we see later on that he ends up getting a house within Sodom. And we see that basically they went separate ways, that way that each of them could prosper and have what they need as far as space is concerned, and so on and so forth. But it says here in Genesis 13:13, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't any one particular sin. It was a very corrupt and vile city, that there was murders throughout the streets all the time. There was thefts, thievery, and robbery all the time. Nobody had any care for anyone there. And there was rapes, all kinds of bad stuff that constantly happened within the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they were very corrupt and vile before the Lord. So that's what it's talking about here, and what it covers right here in this section, in this verse, I should say. So 14, and the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. So Genesis 13:14, God tells Abram to look around southward and northward and eastward and westward to all the land that's about him there in the land of Canaan, the whole area. And, this will be his land and his possession for his generations after him and his descendants. All this land there in the land of Canaan. So in 15, Genesis 13:15, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. So we see that God is promising Abram, yet again, I'm going to give you all this land, and it's all going to be yours, even as a possession forever, that your generations and all your descendants will dwell in this land, and they'll have the Lord's blessing upon them. And we see all these promises that God's giving Abram, the one he chose, and his elect for this cause, that we see that God has chosen him for this purpose, and God has plans for Abram. And he literally forsakes and leaves everything that he has, Abram does, and follows the Lord because of this promise, and just because God asked him to do it, and he willingly obeyed and listened to the Lord and what the Lord wanted him to do. But he says, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. This is a blessing that they're going to inherit forever. It's that land is meant to always be theirs. And, they are meant to just always have this land in possession until the end of time. And always. So Genesis 13:16, and I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. So this is talking about thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. And it's incredible to look at this, because this is from one man, that he's the patriarch of what God has planned and what God has stored for him to be. He's the patriarch of all the generations coming after him. And there's other patriarchs too, as we'll eventually cover and go over later throughout Genesis. But we see that, the promises of God are here, and says, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. So a whole nation of people is to come from Abram, and everything is to be, God chooses Abram for this purpose. And, but they have to get through the land of, everything that's going on there with Sodom and Gomorrah. There's stuff that ends up happening, as we'll cover here shortly in the next videos to come. But all this happens, and all this, there's a lot that goes on, and he doesn't really become a nation till way later on. But this is the start and the genesis, so to speak, the beginning of what God has in store for Israel, for Israel, but for his chosen people, for the descendant and the seed of Abraham, the descendants that are to come from Abram. And we'll see too later on in the story that there's even other people that are not the direct, like they'll be the descendants of Abraham, but they won't be what will become next after this. They won't be, like there'll be other people that are descendants from Abraham, but it's not all particularly one nation like, as that father of many nations actually come from Abraham. And, we see all these things that transpire, and, we see all these things that happen going through the story, and we see that, God follows through with his promises, because we see later on what ends up happening with Abraham's story, because Abraham obeyed the Lord and did as the Lord said unto him to do in the land of Haran. But that's the message for today, and you all have a blessed day.